This is Jonathan Yates with HBCU Game Day Network. We're on Capitol Hill with Congressman Ro Khanna from California. Representative, thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, Norman Chad, he wrote in the Washington Post that California is often the punchline, but often the pace setter. Recently, the California legislature was definitely the pace setter in letting college athletes receive pay for images and for sponsorship deals. How do you feel about that?
I strongly support it. I'm surprised it's taken this long. I mean, it's just common sense. If you're an athlete and people are profiting off your name, of your brand, you should get compensated. I mean, if you appear in a television ad, if you're sponsoring something, why aren't you getting compensated for that? So all this did is took away restrictions for players to get compensated for their own brands.
Now, I had a lawyer on the show, and he said really nothing was going to happen until Congress took action. Now, you have a bill on the House side from Representative Mark Walker, who was on our show, and Representative Cedric Richmond. And on the Senate side, Romney, Rubio, and Senator Murphy from Connecticut are all willing to take action. Do you see Congress moving on this issue?
I do, and it's encouraging that it's bipartisan. The American tradition is that you should be compensated for the rewards of your work. And that's what this is about. It's about making sure that it's not large corporations that are profiting off young players, but that they are getting some of that compensation. And many of these athletes, as you know, come from working class, middle class families. For them, this money could mean security for their parents, for their families, a house for their family. So it's just wrong that they aren't getting the benefits of what they've earned.
Now, Representative Walker, when he was on the show, he said that 40 to 45% of college players come from low-income households. So you have one of the best intellectual property law backgrounds probably ever for a member of Congress. How do you see them being able to protect their interests? I mean, I don't think they're going to be selling it to private equity firms for patent trolling, but how would a college player be able to protect his interests for his image?
Well, I know in Northwestern, for example, some of the players actually talked about unionizing. So you could encourage greater worker protections for these players. But that's exactly what the California law is designed to address, that you have to be compensating players for their brand. I mean, that's basically what the law comes down to. And Congressman Walker is absolutely right. A lot of these players are making it into college athletics is their way out often of some very hard conditions. And they finally get there and they still don't have basic economic security. And many of these players, they're working basically 40 to 50 hours. So they aren't able to take the same academic courses as others are. And they're often left without a great salary because very few of them make it to the pros.
You have come out and supported Senator Bernie Sanders.
I have.
Now, Senator Sanders came out and said, I want to pay the athletes. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think that this is a form of compensation, but I'd be open to any form of compensation for athletics, but we have to make sure that it's done in a correct way. I mean, there are a lot of sports. You can't just privilege certain sports, and universities have a lot of demands on their resources. So I think a good start is what we've done in California. Allow athletes to have sponsorships, allow them to get compensated for their brand.
So it was a busy day on the other side of the hill. On that same day, Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts came out and said we should allow college athletes to unionize. How do you feel about that?
I agree with that. I mean, I think, like I cited the Northwestern example, I mean, I think college athletes should have the right to be compensated for their labor and their other things, right? I mean, they may want to make sure they have the time to take certain classes. They may want to make sure they're not being overworked or have way too many practices, and that they have correct protections against injury. So there are a lot of things I think that college athletes should have the right to do.
Now, you also have your own legislation setting up single-payer systems state by state. College athletes have always sort of had a special place before the courts and with the health care. How would you carve out provisions to protect the health care for college athletes?
Well, here's the thing. While college athletes are in school, they probably have some of the best health care in the world.
Without question.
But what happens when they leave school? If they don't make the pros, and if they make the pros, they continue to have great health care. But my concern is with the 70, 80, 90% who don't make it into the pros. Suddenly then they may have sustained certain injuries as a high school athlete, as a college athlete, and then they don't have health care. Under Medicare for All, an improved Medicare for All, they would have great health care for the rest of their lives, and they wouldn't have copays and premiums and deductibles. Who's going to pay for it? The rich corporations, the billionaires and the millionaires are going to pay for it so that every American can get basic good health care.
So you would be willing to let the present system of health care for college athletes continue?
Sure. I mean, I don't think that is something that would be taken away under a Medicare for All system. But I do believe that some of the things may actually be improved in Medicare for All that current college athletes don't have. But it's very important to understand this about Medicare for All. Medicare for All provides a coverage for no premiums, no cost to everyone. If you want supplemental to that, if you want to get individualized care or more benefits, you can do that. Nothing prevents you from getting supplemental coverage, concierge services. So college athletes, colleges that want to invest more in their athletes, they can still do that.
So from what you're telling me, California could have a huge recruiting advantages for college athletes with your health care bill in place.
Sure. I mean, I don't know if that's the reason to do it. I don't want to give my home state. We got a lot of good schools.
But there's no California football team in the top 20, so they might need
this year. Usually Stanford, UCLA, USC are pretty good. I know Ohio State and others are doing well this season. But but I don't know if it privileges California. It just allows every state to have a good health care, and it creates a more even playing field. You know what it actually does? It allows a school that's not as rich and that doesn't have the resources of, let's say, University of Michigan or an Ohio State to have a shot, because their players are going to get good health care too, and they don't have to just have the expense of providing good health care.
Now, speaking of California, you have a remarkable background. How did you end up representing California in Congress?
Well, I went out there because I was drawn by technology, and I thought technology was going to be the future. And it is something I want to touch on and talk about. For many Americans growing up, they see sports as their one way to make it, to have a decent life, to make money, to provide for their families. And I'd love in this country for us to be able to think of STEM jobs and technology jobs as an avenue to that. That your only choice doesn't have to be to go be an athlete and a star player at Ohio State or at Michigan, that you could actually get a job in technology and provide for your family as well. And one of the things I'm so passionate about is kids who grow up in my district around Apple, Google, Facebook, they see that possibility, but not enough Americans in many communities see that as a real possibility. And a lot of my work is trying to expand the technology opportunities to more people.
Now, when I taught at the University of Iowa, one of the things that I focused on in our classes was that sports was one of the most intellectually stimulating areas out there. As you know, Aristotle said that's when human beings are closest to pure contemplation.
I didn't know that.
Is when we're playing games. So, and there was a good article in Outside Magazine that talked about some neuroscientists at MIT, and it was because of their love for mountain climbing that they created certain robotics and prosthetics for legs. Have you looked at how technology impacts sports and how sports brings out the best in it?
It's a great question. I do think technology can make sports in some places safer in allowing the technology to prevent injury, to allow rehabilitation. It can also help more people participate in sports. If you didn't have certain physical abilities, that technology can enable that participation. But I also think, to your point, we're often too addicted to our cell phones and to all the gadgets, and taking time away to play football or baseball or soccer can make a difference. You know, when I was growing up, you didn't just spend all your time in front of your telephone or your iPhone or in front of video games. You played touch football, you played baseball and backyard street hockey, and I think that is missing to some extent because we're in such a wired world. So sports can also allow you to disengage from the daily grind and do something important.
You know, one of the more inspirational things for the HBCU community, you've worked with Representative John Lewis up here. I mean, I read an op-ed you two wrote together in the Boston Globe. What spurred that?
Well, John Lewis is a hero. He's a genuine American hero. I mean, he was beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge so that African Americans could get the right to vote.
I think your grandfather's a lot of hero to people, too.
My grandfather, I would say, is a hero, too. And John Lewis told me when I told him my story that my grandfather spent 4 years in jail with Gandhi during the 1940s, during the Gandhi's independence movement for India's independence. John Lewis said, you know, Ro, Gandhi influenced me. Gandhi influenced the entire civil rights movement. And he spoke about James Lawson, who went to India and learned about what Gandhi did and shared that with Dr. King and John Lewis. And the civil rights movement was inspired in many ways by Gandhi's nonviolent movement. In fact, Dr. King carried only 2 books with him at all times, the Bible and the Gandhi Reader. So we wrote an op-ed together about the links between Gandhi's independence movement, Dr. King's civil rights movement, and then my parents actually coming to America, because before 1965, we didn't allow many people to come from Asia into our country. It was Dr. King's civil rights movement that led to the Immigration Reform Act that Johnson signed that allowed so many people from India and China and others to come to America. And here's one other point for you. Guess where a lot of those Indian Americans taught? At HBCUs, because a lot of the traditional universities didn't hire them originally, but the HBCUs took a shot on them. So there's a huge linkage between Indian American faculty and the HBCUs.
You know, it's interesting you make that point. I had Dr. Brenda Allen, the president of Lincoln University, on my show, and she pointed out that Lincoln University used to have a strong relationship with Princeton University, which is not that far apart. You grew up in Pennsylvania.
Yes.
You knew where both are. But she said when they started taking away their talent and their thing, that all of a sudden the relationship started to get a little weaker and stuff. So I guess, you know, the Hart-Cuellar Act was good for bringing in to fill that necessary gap.
Absolutely.
Now, Dr. King, he also told Jackie Robinson, the first African-American baseball player who played for the Dodgers in 1947, that if it hadn't been for you, there would have been no civil rights movement in the United States. How do you look upon the sports aspect of civil rights?
I completely agree with that. I mean, our sports athletes so many times are paving the way for greater justice, for raising awareness on key issues. Kaepernick did that on issues of police brutality. When Steve Kerr speaks out about gun violence, that influences the debate. At one point, I thought you'd have a Kerr Popovich ticket in 2020.
That would have a great outside shot.
That would be
for
the
sure.
true outsiders. But look, sports is a great American tradition. It's a place where it doesn't matter what your race is, what your religion is. If you can hit the ball well, if you can throw a football well, that's what matters, right? I mean, ultimately, it's ultimate meritocracy, and there's a camaraderie that's built by it. And so it's something that can help us understand how do we stitch the fabric of this country together in a multicultural society. But it's important to realize that you don't have to just be a star athlete. You don't have to just aspire to make it into the pros, to really understand the value of sports. And you shouldn't just look at sports as your only option of making it in society. That's wrong as well.
So speaking of great outside shooters like Kerr and Popovich, let's bring the last question to President Obama, who's an inspiration to us all.
Yes.
You were an early mover with him, to use a high-tech phrase.
I was.
How did you recognize the greatness of him at such a young age?
I don't know if he recognized his own greatness back then. I mean, when I worked as knocked on doors.
How did you meet him? Was he a professor at yours?
He was a professor. He was a lecturer at University of Chicago. I was volunteering at Blue Gargoyle, which was a math science tutoring place in the south side of Chicago. And Will Burns was the head of Blue Gargoyle, and he was Obama's field director for the state Senate race. Long after I realized that Obama had that race won, and the field program was just to outreach to the community. But to make a good impression on Will Burns, who was my boss at Blue Gargoyle, I stood outside shopping centers and handed out flyers for Barack Obama. Back then, his aspiration was to be the mayor of Chicago. His inspiration was Harold Washington. But to give you a sense of how unknown he was, in 1998, a friend of mine and I organized this major conference at the University of Chicago, and we were inviting heads of state and famous academics, and we invited Carol Moseley Braun, and no one thought to even send an invite to then State Senator Barack Obama. So, he had a meteoric rise.
So, Representative, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
This is Jonathan Yates with HBCU Game Day Network. Thank you for joining us.